Fern has earned a degree in a BA in anthropology and American Studies from St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. And she has a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Oklahoma. That's the scripted part. She has worked for the State Historical Society of North Dakota for something over 30 years, during which time she started as a research archaeologist, progressed to chief archaeologist, and then she became the director of the Division of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. And somewhere along the line, she also became the director of the North Dakota Historical Society sites, some 57, I believe. Somehow those two have kind of grown together, so she lost the title, but the work didn't decrease at all. And I thought I would give you some idea of what it is that she does. The Archaeology and Historic Preservation Division provides for the preparation of a statewide historic preservation plan and inventories, evaluates, nominates sites for listing on the state and the national registers of historic places. The division assists in the preservation of historic properties at all levels and reviews and comments to sponsoring agencies on federally assisted projects to assure that historic values are considered in project planning and execution. The division also provides for interpretation, programming, maintenance, repair, and operational control for all land and buildings in the custody of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, which includes 56 state historic sites.
57, yeah.
Oh, you drew one.
We do have one, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
The division is responsible for constructing interpretive and visitor use facilities and implementing plans and recommendations relating to the historic preservation of sites and buildings. Ladies and gentlemen, Fern Swenson.
Well, thanks for coming out tonight. It's good to see such a large crowd, and I think it speaks wonders for you know, the interest in Double Ditch, you know, from the local community. And it was you know, people in the community, and of course the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation that really came to bat for the preservation of this site and the stabilization. We've worked closely with MHA throughout the years. When we were doing archaeology at the site in the early 2000s, we had a research project out there for 4 years. And then we're fortunate, in fact, that that research project happened because it did provide some information that we could use when this site started to erode into the river as well. So, you know, building on that information over years, you know, is very important. And when the work has been done out at the site too, we've been very closely associated with MHA, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, in finding interpreters to be there when we were doing the archaeology early in those years. And of course, during the last few years with the stabilization, we've been involved with the tribal office, the chairman's office, as well as the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and other representatives, particularly in the Twin Buttes area, which is the Mandan community. And that's going to continue as the project is completed, and we'll have a celebration sometime next summer to celebrate the success of this project. The cooperation that we had between many organizations and individuals, and you know, I have to make sure I mention Emily Sackerson. She organized some people to bring to the attention the needs that we had out at Double Ditch. Elijah Benson as well. I'm sure I'm going to forget somebody else, and I apologize. And we do have some staff people here too. Tim Reed, who was involved, was actively monitoring the site beforehand, and when the construction started, he was involved in the recovery of the burials, working with MHA, of course. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Double Ditch is one of the most spectacular sites in North Dakota, and it's been recognized previously as one of the best preserved Mandan or Plains Village site in North and South Dakota. And of course, we want to keep it that way. And early on, the site was recognized for its significance by Will and Spinden. They did the first excavations at the site in 1905, produced a report in 1 year called The Mandans. It's still a classic publication, although the more recent work updated that information and provided new information. It's still important to recognize the first and the classic work that was done at the site. And even before that, Lewis and Clark, as they're coming upriver, the site was noticed, so it's very visible. I remember in 1981 when I came to Bismarck for a Plains Anthropological Conference, and of course one of the field trips was to Double Ditch State Historic Site, and I went out there and I went, oh my gosh, what's going on here? It's so complicated. So it was great years later to be able to become more familiar with the site. But it's always a site that there'll be field trips to whenever we have conferences, in Bismarck here. So. In the 1400s, the map on the left shows where the Mandan, Hidatsa, and the Riccara territories were. And then on the right, it shows actually the traditional Mandan sites that date to about 1490 to 1785. Some of these sites, like Double Ditch, which is the largest east side village, was occupied for nearly 300 years. That's the same for the Larson site, a couple miles north of Double Ditch. And then on the west side, of course, Matsif is the largest west side village. We know very little about that village compared to the other ones that have been worked on. But on a slant, also occupied for a very long time, and Boley. And not quite as long, scattered village, maybe a couple hundred years, and that's underneath the city of Mandan. And then Ward, this is an older map, so that Ward is actually Chief Looking's village now. That site's very important. It's right in the city limits of Bismarck, but the importance of that, it was occupied for a very short period of time, 25 to 50 years. What's important about that is that these other sites are so complex because of the long occupation. You can imagine, thousands of people living in the same area for that length of time. It's going to, areas of the site are going to be reused over and over again. There's going to be features that overlap with earlier features. So having a site that was occupied for a shorter period of time gives us more information regarding changes in architecture, because the architecture did change over 300 years. Went from long rectangular houses to the circular earth lodges, which everybody would have seen out on a slant or up at Knife River Indian villages. And Square Buttes here, of course, separates the territory between the Hidatsa and the Mandans. And previously, the Mandans had several villages, down in South Dakota too. And as they were pushed north by the Arikras, the territory became more concentrated on the North Dakota side. Okay, these were cities. I mean, imagine when it was first occupied, there were probably 2,000 to 2,400 people that founded this one site. And that's larger than 93% of the cities in North Dakota today, So think about that. This is the capital for its time. The Mandans, Hidatsa, and Arikara really ruled the Missouri River Valley during this time, and it's just incredible. The cities they had, the trade networks that had been established early on, and by the AD 1200s, and continued. And most of you are more familiar with the Catlin and Bodmer paintings in the 1800s, but these trade networks were much earlier than that. So we have to start thinking about hundreds of years, several hundreds of years, not just the last couple hundred. The reason these became cities, or one of the reasons, is the Mandans were agriculturalists. So they were able to have a surplus of crops that they could use to trade when other groups came in, other nomadic groups came in, bringing other goods. The Mandans would have their crops. They also have other materials as well, perhaps knife river flint. And in exchange, there would be other non-local materials that I'll be talking about in a couple other slides. But in order to have this surplus, you also need to be able to store it. So you have to have storage pits that keep the crops for long periods of times. So in these villages, there's probably thousands of these cache pits, bell-shaped cache pits, and we know that through the geophysics that has been done at many of these sites. And the center one here, you can actually see one of the graduate students excavating a cache pit during one of the years that we did research at that project. The research was actually under the direction of Dr. Stanley A. Ayler. He had worked in the Northern Plains for probably 30 or 40 years, along with Dr. W. Raymond Wood. So we had these experts that had this long history in studying Plains Village sites as partners on these projects, which was fantastic. So the trade networks that the Mandans continued, there was marine shell coming, lots of marine shell beads, as well as the gorgets themselves. Better stop playing with this. So lots of beads, marine shell beads, and other pendants. Catlinite from southwestern Minnesota was coming in, and made into pipes or tablets, or also beads. And these things are also found at the site itself and some of the other sites. Okay, and then what we became really aware of in the 1980s and before as well, many of these sites, these village sites, these large village sites, were really being impacted by development. Roads, housing developments, cultivation, and like I said earlier, Double Ditch was considered one of the most well-preserved sites. There's roads and housing development. This is Boley. Here we've got the Larson site, another road going through it. And this is the Matsif site. It had been cultivated, and we have found out that cultivation alone doesn't necessarily destroy a site because many of the features are buried very deep. But it certainly impacts them. double ditch, we've got slant, good intentions with the CCC, but with reconstructing the lodges on site, it does impact the site. And there was also a road that went through the site. Those are things that we consider now, and then the Sperry site. So that really inspired us to get a research project going at some of these sites. And after Scattered Village excavation, this team of archaeologists worked at Double Ditch. They went on to Larson and to Boley as well, so that we have a sample from some of these sites now. But the largest sample actually comes from Double Ditch. You know, early on, the early excavations by Will and Spinden, the site was thought to be occupied for about 150 years. Well, after the research that was done by this team, we found out the site was occupied for nearly 300 years. But we had the advantage of the technology that is available today, which is incredible. And that's the geophysics that I talked about earlier. This is a magnetometer map. It basically gives you a glimpse of what's underneath the ground without doing any disturbance. Before that was done, we were only aware of the 2 ditches that are visible on the ground surface. And you can see those clearly here as well. But what was revealed in the geophysics, there's actually 4 ditches out there. So this is the most outer ditch, ditch 4, and then in slightly to the inside, there's ditch 3 as well. So the village was first founded with at least 2,000, maybe 2,400 people, and the site contracted over time until the final occupation, which would be this core area or within the inner ditch, and there we're estimating that there were only 400 people by that time. So think about it. You know, you have a founding village of 2,000, maybe 2,400, down to about 400 people before they moved upriver to be near the Hidatsas. And what else we found out was that by the 1500s, these villages really had specialists. They had specialists that were making the pottery. The pottery is incredible. It's very well made. It's very thin. The designs, you can see, you know, are very carefully impressed in the ceramics itself as they were made. And some of the sites were primarily, well, were making lots of the stone beads that then would have been traded to some of the other villages and some of the nomadic people that came in as well. And some villages were making large quantities of bracelets. How do we know that? We not only found whole bracelets, but we also found the debris from making a great deal of bracelets. And then came the flood. So I put these other aerials up so you can get an idea of what the bank looked like beforehand. And then, you know, in 2013, the erosion was showing up oops, there I go again. By the crack that had developed. You know, be talking about what the engineers came up with, what they decided the problem was, and how we could fix the situation as well. But you can see the 1936 and wasn't sure if it's the 1950s or early 1960s. Aerial that we've got there. The bank is fairly stable. Of course, when you've got a bank that's, you know, 80 feet high, it's going to erode to some degree, but not, you know, to the extent that it did after the 2011 flood. So what's the problem? You know, we had to find out what was causing the problem in order to know how to fix the problem. So MHA and the State Historical Society worked together and decided on an engineering firm that would do this work for us. And the people doing that work included Atwell Engineering, Braun Intertech, Wild Horse Resources, and also, let me get this right, River... Well, River Resources Company. So it was, again, they work with a whole team of individuals too with varying expertise in order to figure out what the problem was. So the area that was most disturbed, you can see the drilling rig in, and they did all of these studies in order to determine what was happening there. People had speculated what was happening, but we needed to know for sure what was impacting the site. And during that whole process, during the planning process, MHA and the State Historical Society worked together to decide what are the most important things that we need to consider in the stabilization efforts. Everybody knew that something had to be done because the erosion wasn't going to stop on its own. It would continue. And actually what happened is that there was another crack that was developing as we were going through the planning stages. So this green line right here indicates where the next slumping would have occurred. So that goes across the trail and into the village proper itself. And so one of our staff people, Amy Blyer, she's standing as well as, you know, where the flags are, which you could actually see where the crack was developing. It was a small depression occurring. You couldn't see a crack, but you could see what was going to happen. And this was also measured by the geotech information that was gathering. They were tracking how much movement was occurring over time. So this was very important. And I like this image that the engineers prepared. This basically explains what was happening to the site. During the 2011 flood, the clay toe eroded away. So the bank became unstable. And with the steep bank and the weight from the top of the bank, large blocks were breaking off, pushing the weight down and pushing it into the river itself. And each time that happens, oops, there you go again. Each time that happened, you could see the phases of as the blocks were pushing, the weight was pushing into the river. And that's why you get that rotational erosion that happened at the site as well. So they came up with this plan. We said, okay, we would have to have you stay on the west side of the walking trail and the bicycle trail. And that trail used to be Highway 1804. So that area had been disturbed previously too. We wanted to have as little impact, you know, on the site as possible. So that's why we wanted all the construction to stay west of the previous road. But also we wanted to keep as much of the material that came from the stabilization that had to be moved on the site itself, like glacial erratics that came out when they had to do the reshaping of the bank. So all of those things were considered in the planning stage. And, you know, initially, you know, we've got the rock key, down below, which puts weight on the toe. We stayed out of the river. We had to stay above the high water mark. But we had the rock key that put the weight down by the toe. In addition, what the engineer said is you really need some pipe piles as well. So they put rows of these pipe piles just on the other side of the rock key, as this diagram shows. And each pipe pile was about 12 inches in diameter, and they were spaced about a yard apart. So we've got a wall of pipe piles too. And the problem was they needed to make sure that the pipe piles went deep enough through the deformed cannonball formation and into the stable cannonball formation. So in order for the pipe piles to actually work, to help stabilize the bank, that's what the construction people had to do as well. And then, of course, there is taking some of the weight off the top of the bank, and that's reshaping of the bank itself. Oh, okay, the next picture here. We have to give a shout out to the construction people as well, Vite Construction. We're great to work with. Here's Johnny Fay and Cabo Costello. They worked for about 2 months, month and a half maybe, Tim, with the archaeologists. 4 of the archaeologists at the State Historical Society, I'll call them out too. Tim Reed, raise your hand. Megan Schoenfelder, Brooke Morgan, and Paul Pica. And they had very long days and very difficult, conditions. And it was not an easy process that they had to go through, but it was necessary. So here are some photos of what the rock trench actually looked like. They put in the trench and in came the trucks and unloaded the rock. And part of the process too is we wanted everything to look as natural as possible after the bank was secured. So even the pipe piles, the rock trench, everything was covered up later. So, and then replanted in prairie grasses, cottonwoods, and other brush. But, pounding in these pipe piles, that took considerable time as well. But you can see 2 rows of pipe piles that went all the way around. So then the recontoured slope. Some of the dirt had to be removed from the upper part. And, well, this whole area here, if you remember what it looked like before with all the tension cracks and all the erosion that had happened, this is what it looks like today, only there's vegetation and snow on it, so. On the north end of the site too, we had to take some of the weight off the bank there as well, but it didn't go back nearly as far. So when that was being done, we thought, okay, well, let's, in this coulee area, let's make a landing for non-motorized vehicles. So canoes and kayaks could use this as a landing place as well, and that would just provide further enhancement to the site. This is after the construction was done. Here's the landing now. We're waiting for the grass, of course, to grow up, prairie grass. We've got the glacial erratics along the side. We'll be able to do interpretation regarding those natural resources as well. And then this photograph, this aerial photograph, shows the landing here and the stretch towards where the major stabilization efforts had to happen. Another one of the before and after. I know many of you saw in the newspaper at the time the number of burials that were recovered. I want to point out that all the burials were really concentrated in this area right here. So further up along here, we were fortunate that there were not features. There was a scattering of artifacts, and that should be expected because there would be activity areas outside the village proper area itself. But that area was monitored as well. And before that, we had had a geophysics survey done all along this stretch here in preparation, so that anything could be salvaged prior to the stabilization efforts taking place. And there were some anomalies identified, and the same archaeologists that did the monitoring throughout the stabilization also did the testing of those anomalies, and none of those turned out to be archaeological features. So we were feeling, pretty good about at least part of the project area, not destroying any other features. So in conclusion here, the most important, the site is protected. It's preserved. And yes, there were lots of burials that had to be moved, but there really wasn't a choice. They were done, in consultation with the Mandan, Hidatsa and Arikara Nation, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and others as well in the Twin Buttes area. And so we always had to keep in mind what the end game was, and that was to preserve the site. So luckily that's been done, but there's also a few other enhancements that got done along the way as well. Fishing access is better. John Campbell will appreciate that. We've got the landing for kayaks and canoes. We've got bird watching, wildlife watching. There'll be some benches and other interpretation added in the spring as well after the vegetation comes up. So it'll be a nice place to just sit and relax and enjoy the river. That river is just incredible, and there aren't that many places where you can enjoy it, because most of it is private property. And it just provides one more area where you can go out there, walk through the village, look at the interpretive signs, but also walk along the bank edge and sit along the bank and just enjoy the silence. But not in the fall or the spring when the geese come by, because it's very loud out there. And then the trail will be open again as well for bicycles and walking.